All right, welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into a mystery that's centuries old. We're talking about one of the greatest military machines in history, Charlemagne's super army. But the big question is, how was it actually built?
So, back in the 9th century, at its absolute peak under Charlemagne, the Carolingian Empire was a real titan. I mean, it stretched all the way from the mountains of Spain to the forests of Germany, and this thing was forged in battle, right? By this legendary military that just steamrolled dozens of peoples across Europe. You know, the Saxons, the Lombards, the Avars, the list just keeps going.
So, how in the world was this incredible army actually put together? You'd think for a force this famous, we'd have a straightforward answer, right? Well, we don't. Not even close. In fact, for decades, this has been a huge debate among historians.
And that's what we're doing today. We are opening the case file on Charlemagne's army. We're going to follow the clues, we're going to weigh the evidence for all these competing theories, and hopefully get to the bottom of this absolutely fascinating historical mystery.
So here's our plan of attack. First up, we're going to look at the cryptic clues that were left behind. Then, we'll dive into 3 competing theories about how this army actually worked. And finally, we'll deliver our verdict.
Okay, so every good investigation has to start with the evidence, right? For us, that means we have to dig into the primary sources. And in this case, that means these royal decrees called capitularies. Now, these things weren't law books etched in stone, not at all. It's better to think of them as, situational internal memos, or maybe the minutes from a big meeting with the king's top advisors. See, they were meant to fix very specific local problems, not create some grand universal legal code. And that right there is why they are so incredibly tricky for historians to interpret.
And right here, this is a key piece of evidence. This quote from one of those capitularies lays out a pretty clear rule. Your wealth, which they measured in these units called mansos, was directly tied to your military service.
So what this system did, basically, was create a sort of military co-op. If you were a wealthier guy, you served on your own. But if you were one of the poorer free men, you got grouped together with others to pool your resources and send just one, fully equipped warrior to the front. The big question, though, is how do we interpret this? Was this a brand new rule, or was it just an update to an old one? That is the core of the whole debate.
And that question of interpretation, well, it leads us straight to our first major theory, the warband model. The thinking here is that Charlemagne's army was motivated by one thing and one thing only: plunder.
So this theory suggests the army wasn't really a national force at all. Instead, it was more like a collection of private warbands. Each one was loyal to a powerful lord, and they were all fueled by the spoils of war. You can almost think of it like a military business enterprise, all driven by the hunt for treasure and glory. Okay, but here's where we see the central problem with this theory. On the one hand, yeah, it totally explains why Charlemagne might have needed new laws to force people to serve. Once the empire stopped expanding, the plunder dried up and these warriors lost their main motivation. Makes sense. But, on the other hand, huge treasure falls were actually pretty rare. And even more importantly, there's just no way that small bands of loot-hungry warriors could have pulled off the really complex siege warfare that the Carolingians were famous for.
Which naturally brings us to theory number 2. This one looks past that whole Germanic warband tradition and instead finds the army's origins in the empire that came before them, Rome.
See, this model argues that Charlemagne wasn't really inventing anything new here. He was just continuing a system of universal military obligation that the Franks inherited straight from the late Roman Empire. In this view, this was a state army, built on the civic duty of its people.
According to this theory, the army was this massive, 3-tiered organization. So at the bottom, you had a general levy for local defense. Then, in the middle, you had the expeditionary force, the guys chosen by wealth for campaigns. And right at the top, a core of full-time professional soldiers. Proponents of this theory argue that this whole system could field over 100,000 men. I mean, that is a truly colossal force for that time period.
Now look, this theory does a great job explaining the sheer scale and organizational power of Charlemagne's campaigns. It really does. But it has a huge problem. There's just no clear evidence for it in the sources. The capitularies only mention free men, not some universal draft. And there's no systematic mention of a general levy or these distinct household troops. So the theory's main pillars, they're built on some pretty shaky ground.
So, when you put these two theories side by side, you've got two completely different visions of the exact same army.
One is this small, elite force driven by profit. The other is a massive state army driven by duty. It's this stark contradiction that has led historians to a third, more recent explanation, one that tries to find a middle ground.
Okay, so this third model, it shifts the focus. It moves away from these grand laws or ancient traditions, and instead it looks at the social fabric of the empire itself. You know, the web of human relationships that really held the whole thing together.
In this view, the army wasn't just raised by a single top-down order from the king. Instead, it was assembled from the ground up through this huge network of personal obligations, relationships, and loyalties, all happening at the local level.
So here's how it probably worked. The king calls on his powerful nobles, right? His counts, his bishops. They, in turn, call on their local followers, these guys who are technically free, but really depended on that noble for their land, their jobs, their protection. So military service then, it wasn't some direct order from a distant king you'd never met. It was an obligation you had to your local patron, to your lord.
All right, so after looking at all the evidence and these competing theories, which one solves the case of Charlemagne's army?
Well, the reality is, and this is so often the case in history, isn't it? There's no single simple answer. The Carolingian army was probably a really complex, kind of messy mix of all these things. You likely had elite war bands fighting for plunder, right alongside men serving out of a sense of duty to the state. And the whole structure probably changed depending on the region and the needs of a specific campaign.
But today, that patron-client model is really considered the leading theory. And not because it just throws the other ideas out the window, it's because it gives us the most compelling social mechanism for how it all actually worked. It shows us how a command from the king could be translated into real action on the ground hundreds of miles away, all through this intricate network of human relationships.
And that leaves us with a really powerful final thought. What if the secret to building an empire isn't just about grand laws on paper or all-powerful rulers? What if it's really about the strength of the personal connections between people? The case of Charlemagne's army, it isn't just some dusty historical puzzle. It's a reminder that empires are built and, broken, one human relationship at a time.